Halima Taha is a committed arts advocate nurturing the development, documentation, and acquisition of Black visual culture. Her professional practice spans curatorial, art advisory, appraisal, and strategic plannings to serve corporate, academic, and civic programs and audiences. She is best known for her groundbreaking bestseller, Collecting African American Art, Works on Paper and Canvas, which in 1998 validated collecting fine art by Americans of African descent as viable assets in the marketplace. Her work was the catalyst for ushering major museums to purchase collections of African American art within the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Halima's research and professional career have brought her in direct connection with artists from both the exhibitions, David Driscoll, Icons of Nature and History, and working together, the photographers of the Kamunge Workshop. And it is my great privilege to welcome you tonight. Hi, Halima.
Hello, Emily. Thank you so much. I want to thank you again, as well as Nathaniel Stein, for inviting me to participate in this evening's program in conjunction with David Driscoll, Icons of Nature and History, and working together the photography of the Kamunge Workshop. Good evening, everyone. I am so happy that you have decided to come out to participate in this discussion after seeing Black art in the absence of light. And I would like to just say that there are 3 things that I would like to contribute to the discourse presented in Black art in the absence of light. And the first is that I want to talk about the basis for the fundamental challenges American artists of African descent have had in being included in museum and private collections, as well as auction houses and history books. I want to expand upon that a little bit more, as well as talk about the legacy of necessity, or the tradition of necessity, what that means when it comes to Black visual culture and the marketplace. In addition to that, the last thing I'd like to address is the marketplace, why there has been this increased interest in Black visual culture. For some people, it seems like it just came out of nowhere, and that is not the case. So I wanted to provide some clarification about that, with the hope that it will continue to inspire you to learn new and exciting things about yourselves through art and culture worldwide. So to begin with, the basis for the fundamental challenges that American artists of African descent is stemmed in institutional racism. Oh, the big R word. But historically, from the beginning of time, all human beings have had cultural biases and prejudices, and even tribalism has been a factor in the way that people have perceived one group of people over another group of people, and yet people coexisted despite whatever the opinions may have been or the assumptions of one group of people over another. But when you take those prejudices and biases and you combine them with power to make those cultural biases and prejudices into policies and laws that discriminate against a particular group of people that are based on those biases and prejudices, it becomes institutional racism. And it sets up a thought process, and that's perpetuated and reinforced by those policies and laws that have been set in motion. So in the United States, when some of the people in the film talked about the difficulty of being exhibited or not seeing themselves in museums, or not being shown and just doing their work on their own and not being concerned about what anybody else was thinking, that's fine. So I was talking about the justification. I was beginning to talk about the justification for enslaving Africans, being that Africans were subhuman, unintelligent, only good for labor and breeding. And these ideas about people of African descent continued continued and also impacted the way that people perceived any sort of artistic creativity or production as something that was childlike. And it didn't recognize that art fundamentally is about ideas and complex ideas. And it didn't take into account that Africans and people of African descent you benefit from cerebral hemispheric asymmetry like anyone else in terms of left and right brain function. And as makers and artists, they think critically, and divergent thinking is looking at the endless possibilities of an idea, a medium, a texture, and a possibility. So this view and perception to justify enslaving Africans continued to shape the perception of whether or not people of African descent could be artists or not. So in 1897, the New York Herald stated that the Negro seems to have an appreciation for art while manifestly unable to produce it. This statement of ability influenced the perception of worthlessness of Black art to systematically diminish and marginalize the social and economic value of African American art and artists. So this is the basis for the fundamental challenges that American artists of African descent had throughout the 18th and the 19th and the 20th century, and why much of the work was not making it to the market or to the museums or in major collections. So I thought that this was an important point to raise with a little bit more clarity than had been presented in the film. The other area that's important to recognize is the legacy of necessity. What does that mean? Well, I'd like to start with James Porter. In 1943, he wrote Modern Negro Art. It was his master's thesis at New York University. There was a need to write a book about the history of Black American artists, because when he was a student and a younger artist, he later would continue to be an artist and a curator and a scholar, and he was a professor at Howard University, where David Driscoll was a student of his. And he was told as a young artist that when he asked, why weren't the artists from the Harlem Renaissance celebrated, or why wasn't there any critical acclaim? And he was told it was because Black people do not have a history where they have been in this country long enough. So this was the catalyst and for the research for him to write the book Modern Negro Art in 1943 and say, yes, we do have a history. And this book is the foundation for the field of African American art history. David Driscoll's 2 Centuries of Black American Art, the exhibition and the publication and the film, took place in 1976. And in 1976, this is now 33 years after Porter's book. And he is continuing in the tradition of necessity of Porter and saying, yes, we have a history, but not only do we have a history, we have been here for 200 years. And the recognition that if Black people in the United States do not write their own history and document their successes and the triumphs and also any aspect of their history, it won't be written. And if it is written, it will be written through the lens of disparity and disdain, and not an honest view or assessment of the cultural achievements. Because again, in American history books, the books teach that, Black Americans began with slavery when they did not. They're descendants of enslaved Africans who came from very, very sophisticated civilizations, where making was an integral part of the society and the culture. Continuing this tradition of necessity, a year later, in 1978, Dr. Samela Lewis wrote the first African American art history book as the first Black scholar with a PhD in art history. And this was a major cornerstone to the work of James Porter and David Driscoll. And she received her degree in 1955. Prior to that, there had not been a person of African descent or a woman who studied and had earned a PhD in art history. 19 years later, we have Dr. Richard Powell, who wrote Black Art and Culture in the 20th Century in 1997. And again, this particular book was the first book to talk about Black art from an interdisciplinary perspective within the context of Black culture, and looking at the literary, performing, and the visual arts and how they interacted with one another and supported the culture. And this seminal work also comes out of the legacy of necessity to tell the stories, to expose the history and the truth, and to provoke thought, and to also show the intellectual diversity in the styles and the ideas behind the art that makes up Black visual culture. Continuing in this tradition of necessity, we have the National Black Fine Art Show that took place also the same year that Dr. Richard Powell's book was published in 1997. And the National Black Fine Art Show was created by a man by the name of Jocelyn Wainwright. And Jocelyn Wainwright felt that there should be an art fair that represented artists from throughout the African diaspora. And this was a major event that took place from 1997 to 2008 in New York City at the Puck Building on Lafayette Street. And it was a major, major event. People ascended to New York City every year, few days before Super Bowl weekend, to come to the National Black Fine Art Show, because under one roof, it was the first time you had the opportunity to see work, local, regional, national, international works by major artists of African descent. People were interacting with art dealers and curators and collectors and students and other artists. And it was a major event. And the same kind of disdain and criticism based on not understanding that there is a historic linear aesthetic pedigree within Black visual culture, but also one that all artists share when they are looking at art from all over the world. The same criticism that Holland Kotler gave 2 centuries of Black American art that was discussed in the film briefly when David Driscoll was speaking with Tom Brokaw. They really had bad things to say about the show, and they minimized the value of the work. They diminished the value of the work and didn't look at the work in the context as they would other work that were at other art fairs. And this continued. But again, this need to create an exhibition that would be for sale of works was also a part of the tradition of necessity. And my work comes out of this tradition of necessity too. Collecting African American art came out a year after Rick Powell's book, but the same and a year after the National Black Fine Art Show. And this book came about after having an art gallery in the 1980s in Gramercy Park. And much of the 1970s and the 80s was spent educating people about Black visual culture. There were only about 5 books at the time about African American artists, whereas now here we are in the first 22 years of the 21st century, and there are thousands of artist monographs and African American art history books and art history books about the African diaspora. But at that time, coming out of this tradition, what I was trying to say was, yes, we have a history. What do we do with this wonderful history? Let's look at historical materialism and let's collect it. And as it represents the visual conscience of the time in which the artists live, no different than the art that has been left behind by the people of the lost city of Pompeii or pharaonic Egyptians. Or the Mayans or the Aztecs. We have this cultural legacy that is available to be collected and written about. So this is also a very important part of how we got to this century and what you're seeing in the marketplace. There would be no Black art in the absence of light film had it not been for the work of David Driscoll, had it not been for the work of James Porter, had it not been for the work of Samela Lewis or for Richard Powell. And the marketplace certainly would not be where it is had it not been for the National Black Fine Art Show and a publication and educational programs in conjunction with the art show that allowed for people to learn about Black visual culture, how to make connections, how to collect, how to care for the work. And then, of course, because of the National Black Fine Art Show and the success of collecting African American art prior to all the social media being the way it is today, it was astounding that such a book that after 8 years of being told that Black people don't buy art, white people don't buy art by Black people, and Black people don't collect art by major art publishers. It took that long to be able to publish the book because, again, the fundamental basis for perception of value, or the lack of value, I should say, of Black visual culture was very strong and prevalent at the end of the 20th century. So, before I move on to just briefly talking about the marketplace, I also want to point out that in this wonderful these two exhibitions, David Driscoll, Icons of Nature and History, and working together the photographs of the Kamoinge workshop, David Driscoll was many different things in addition to an artist, as many of you are aware. He was a scholar, he was a curator, he was a historian, he was a teacher, he was a mentor, he was an incredible artist. He was a writer and a researcher. And so out of a need to continue the work of David Driscoll and the impact that he's had on the field, the David Driscoll Center for the Study of African American Art and the African Diaspora, located at the University of Maryland, is a very, very important resource for those of you in the audience who are artists and scholars and students and collectors. And they have many of the archives online that you can access, but if you have a chance, you should visit the center, because there are letters between David Driscoll and all of the artists that you saw in this film, and many of the artists who were a part of the Harlem Renaissance and throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to the present. There are films and audio recordings and books, and also there is a collection of work from the 19th century to the present that you have access to learn more about Black visual culture. But again, the necessity for an institution like this, where this kind of focus exists, is why the David Driscoll Center is here, and they are committed to collecting, documenting, and presenting African American art, as well as replenishing and expanding the field. Kamoinge as a group also emerged out of necessity because Black photographers since 1963 did not have a support system whatsoever within the world of photography. So they created their own support system and worked together and shared resources and had critiques of each other's work and pulled together as a group. The Kamoinge exhibition clearly represents a particular period in the history. Kamoinge is 60 years old. But Kamoinge is still an active group. It's the oldest photography, not-for-profit photography group in the United States, and it's the only Black American photography group in the United States. So Kamoinge's mission is to honor, document, preserve, and represent the history and culture of the African diaspora with integrity and respect for humanity through the lens of Black photographers. So for those of you who would be interested in learning more about Kamoinge and many of the photographers who are members who are not in this exhibition, you can go to Kamoinge, KAMOINGE.com to learn more. Today, Black artists are looking at new ways of thinking about contemporary themes. How are they doing this? They're addressing issues of gender, sex, sexuality, immigration and trade, identity and beauty, politics and race, social justice and technology. And African American artists are combining a diverse blend of aesthetic traditions from Africa, Europe, Asia, the Caribbean, North, South, and Central America. And consequently, they are attracting a international audience of collectors who confirm that American art by artists of African descent is aesthetically and historically relevant. And they are also worthy assets and commodities. This is what's happening now in the 21st century. But why is this work so hot? There are a couple of variables. Has a lot to do with curatorial themes. It has to do with what's happening in Africa, Europe, the United States. It also has to do with globalism and transnationalism and the impact of the internet. So briefly, what's going on in Africa that's affecting the market is the expansion of African cities that's leading to an interest in urbanity, decolonization, the rise of the middle class. There's a creative economy that's expanded, as well as political stability. And new museums, temporary platforms, and galleries, along with economic prosperity, are certainly cultivating a great interest in African diasporic art, particularly in Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa, and in Morocco. In Europe is confronting their colonial histories via African art. And there's right-wing politics, and there's a crisis with their ethnographic collections. In the United States, we are we have woke culture and the rise of a renewed Black consciousness, Black Lives Matter. We are dealing with right-wing politics, a crisis in museology. There's a tremendous amount of deaccessioning of white male art masterworks from different museums where they have multiples of a particular artist so that they can try to fill their historic and aesthetic gaps in their collections. And it's important for museums because of the fact that they will not be relevant without works that represent the people in the United States that come from all different ethnic backgrounds, which makes up the United States. And so relevant in the sense that people want to see and hear narratives that they can relate to, in addition to the aesthetics and the beauty of painting and sculpture. And there's this drive to diversify the collections and the staff. And this is the first time in history where there have been art professionals of African descent who are coming out of art history and curatorial programs and backgrounds, and who grew up with fine art by African American artists because their parents were many of the collectors that were buying work from the National Black Fine Art Show, or who were started collecting in the 1980s at that time when many people had a lot of more disposable income. There's also global shifts that are affecting this marketplace. There's the rise of the creative economy worldwide. Art is an asset class. There's a heightened interest in contemporary art at auctions. 19th century and old masters are a smaller segment. And there's fixation with the contemporary art by museums and the marketplace. We also can look at globalization, transnationalism. The explosion of these art fairs and biennales has had a tremendous impact. In that sense, art has gone mainstream. Art is being used now to market cities, and they're appearing to deal with political issues and locations where cities are created around art fairs by urban planners. Art is amplifying the challenges and exploits, and it's a product of globalism. There's an increase in this concept of borderlessness, and globalization is exposing people to cultures other than their own, as well as there's a democratizing of art, where anyone can see it at a museum or an art fair. Transnational is another component to what's going on in the market, and why you're also seeing more artists of African descent, and particularly many of the artists that are in the film tonight. It's a result of people leaving their countries of origin and settling and working between multiple cities. It's a result of globalism. There are multiple identities and allegiances that people have. There's a sense of a knowledge connectiveness to different countries and cities. And there's cultural and political challenges that collectors and artists are all impacted by. And the main thing is the challenge of the idea of a monolithic identity. This is becoming an anomaly. It's, people are no longer having these monolithic identities because of transnationalism. And of course, we can't ignore the impact that the internet has had on the market, the art market at large, and in particular for Black visual culture. Social media platforms, and the internet are visually driven and are very appealing to collectors. And the exposure to art is possible without travel. Even this program, people will be able to tune in and hear this conversation. People can go on to art dealer websites and museum websites and see virtual exhibitions as if they're walking through the galleries. Of course, it's nothing like seeing the work in person, but it's still, for people who know what they're looking at, it is very exciting. There's a spread of social and political movements through the internet. It implodes or advances racism, feminism, LGBTQIA rights. All of these are connected to the interests expressed in art. And then, of course, with the internet, there's an immersion in virtual worlds that's increasing the drive for real experiences of value for things that cannot be digitally generated. So with all of this going on, how does this manifest in the curatorial themes from within the African diaspora of artists? Well, the curatorial themes revolve around identity and fashioning new of subjectivities and social issues and Black consciousness. They include attaining freedom from the strictures of class, gender, race, and history. They are addressing colonial legacies and geography, space, and place. They're also addressing post-independence and democracy and art-specific subjects and aesthetic movements. All of these variables combined with the excitement of work that has virtually been untapped, and also being able to look at the work and make connections to other collections where you're able to fill the historic and aesthetic gaps in existing institutional and private collections is very, very exciting. And these are the variables that are important. And contrary to some of the articles that have been published in the last 3 years, where there are questions like, where are all the Black art dealers? Like, they never existed. And like these major dealers who have picked up many of these artists are the same dealers, and I was there to bear witness, who did not show any of these artists. And when the artists would go, because, in the 1980s, people sent slides and they mailed their letters and they picked up the telephone and had conversations and made appointments like that. It's nothing like the way we do business today. And when the artists would show up, they were told, we don't show Black art based on the color of their skin. And many of these were abstract artists. And so the assumption that it was all figurative work, and that Black people only wanted to paint images of themselves. Yet the irony of this is that the marketplace is so heavily focused on the figure. by Black artists at this time. But there were 43 Black-owned galleries in the United States at the end of the 20th century. And there are still many in the United States that exist who were responsible for cultivating and developing the careers of many of the artists that people are just discovering, and many of the dealers in the 1980s who were on 57th Street and Soho, because there wasn't a Chelsea as there is now as an art district. They were not interested in showing the work. And if they showed the work, it would be in some remote location or part of the city, because they didn't want to be known as a gallery that showed Black artists. This flip-flop has everything to do with the fact that the 20th century mid-career, many of the 20th century mid-career male artists, particularly, and white male artists, because many of American women of European descent have also struggled in being able to be included in major museums and collections. But most of those men who have been celebrated and heralded, they're dead, dying, or the best work has already been collected. And you may notice that much of the work that people are looking at parallels those white male artists that I'm mentioning, because these artists are in their 70s and 80s, and they are either dead or one foot in the grave. And I hate to be so blunt, but, the business of it is blunt. And, but at the same time, the artists have been very courageous in their commitment to themselves. And all artists are making art for themselves and strangers to experience and to embrace and discover new and exciting or challenging things about themselves and the world in which they live.